Welcome, AP Psychology students. We're going to start a new unit today. We're looking at Unit 6, which is modules 26 through 30 in the textbook. We're all about learning. So what are the different types of learning, especially what we call associative learning, where we learn by associating two things together. So we're going to be looking at what learning is, some of the basic types of it, and then specifically today we'll focus primarily on classical conditioning, which is very interesting but can be a little bit tricky, so put on your thinking caps. It does start, though, this unit with a discussion of kind of the roots of learning and where it comes from, and we start with a discussion of behavioral psychology, or otherwise known as behaviorism. And this starts with a man named John Watson, who's considered the father of behavioral psychology. And the key things from this school of psychology is that they want to view psychology as an objective science. They wanted to get away from studying things that weren't really scientific. We haven't really got into the history much in this course, but prior to this we had things like Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, which, while interesting, was not rooted in science. So this is kind of a reaction to that, saying, no, let's not study stuff that we can't prove or can't demonstrate. Let's only study things that are observable. So they want to study observable behavior, but not things like thoughts, memory, consciousness. And you have to remember that in the 1920s, when this comes around, we don't have modern brain scans. So they don't really have a way of studying how the brain responds to certain thinking processes or memories or dreams or those kind of things. So they can only go based on the external. What can we observe people do? So yeah, we're gonna look at external factors. So if you think about the nature-nurture debate, the behavioral psychology is going to be all about nurture. How does the environment shape who we are? And so they say a lot of what we learn is going to be through the idea of conditioning, getting conditioned to do something, by associating it with something else, and through observation, by watching other people do things and then imitating them. So again, they're going to be very much on the environmental side. They're going to be much more on the nurture side than the nature side, studying brain anatomy and genetics. Kind of an interesting exercise. So if you read this next slide, just kind of think about how much do you agree with the following statement. This is kind of John Watson's famous quote. He's very much a hardcore behaviorist, and he thinks, again, everything is due to the environment. So, read that slide and just kind of think about how much you agree. He would agree definitely a 5. He really did think this way. So just something to consider. You can pause that and read that on your own. So the textbook definition of learning is a relatively permanent change in an organism, so a person or animal or whatever, their behavior due to experience. So experience has changed the way you behave or think in some way. So that's a pretty broad definition. And there's a lot of different forms of learning. Some are very simple, some are very complex. And one form of this would be, it's called habituation, which would just be things like, let's say you're sitting, in your house and you hear this loud explosion. Maybe it's fireworks or something, and the first time you jump up and you're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? But if they keep firing them off, eventually you'll be like, oh, and just more fireworks or whatever, and you won't have the same reaction to it. So you've learned on a very basic level that the loud noise is not something that you need to be worried about. So pretty simple form of learning, but learning nonetheless. Most of this unit is going to be looking at what we call associative learning. So this idea, we tend to learn things by associating two things together. Our minds have a natural tendency to connect things that occur in sequence. So if A happens before B, we tend to assume that A causes B. Now we know by studying correlation that that's not always true, but our mind has this natural mechanism of trying to link those things. So if A happens and then B happens, we say, oh, well, A must have caused B. And it's actually a pretty adaptive trait. It's actually a good thing because these forms of learning allow us to predict the future. and think, this will allow us to escape from danger. So if, in the past something bad has happened, A happens and then B happens and B is bad, the next time we see A, we can anticipate, oh, B's about to happen, let me get out of here. So it's an adaptive trait, but sometimes it can kind of, lead us astray. So we're going to look at a couple of different forms of associative learning. We're going to look at classical conditioning, where you associate two stimuli in your environment. And we're also going to look at operant conditioning, as that's where we associate a response, a behavior, and its consequences. Are they good consequences? Or are they bad consequences? So we're going to start with classical conditioning. I'm going to move ahead a little bit, but it all starts with a man named Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian doctor, and he originally studied dog digestive secretions. And what he found was he would, feed these dogs and track how much they salivated and those kind of things. And he found that when his research assistant, the one who fed the dogs, would come into the room, the dogs would start salivating just when they saw him. And initially he was like, oh, this is messing up my study. Whenever this guy comes in, they start salivating, and it throws off what I'm trying to measure. But then he kind of had an aha moment, like, hey, maybe there's something to this. Maybe I could study this. So that's kind of how he gets his inspiration to study what we now know as classical conditioning. So, again, just to kind of give you an image, they hook these dogs up. They put a little mechanism in their cheek, and what they're doing is they're tracking the amount of saliva that the dogs secrete under various cases. So this is where it gets a little bit technical. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the Pavlov example. So what they did with these dogs is they had what they call an unconditioned stimulus. So the food. The food naturally causes what's called an unconditioned response. So conditioned means learned. So if it's unconditioned, it means it's automatic. Like you didn't take any learning for this to occur. So the unconditioned stimulus is something in your environment outside of the person or the dog or whatever. That's the food. The unconditioned response, the unlearned response, is to salivate when you eat food. Salivate when you eat food. What they did is they paired ringing a bell or a tone or whatever it was. They tried a few different things. And originally, the bell would be what's called a neutral stimulus. It wouldn't naturally cause you to think or behave a certain way. And originally, the bell did not cause the dog to salivate. But what they did is they started ringing the bell, then giving the food, which naturally caused the dog to salivate. And after several times, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, eventually the dog learned to associate the bell with the food. They learned that when the bell rings, I'm about to get food. So eventually, after several trials of ringing the bell and then giving them food, just ringing the bell caused the dog to salivate. So seeing the bell caused the dog to salivate. So there's several terms here. The neutral stimulus, so it says a stimulus that before conditioning does not naturally bring about the response of interest. This is going to be the bell. This is going to be the bell. The unconditioned, again, unconditioned, unlearned stimulus, this is the thing in the environment. So it says effective stimulus that unconditionally, automatically, and naturally triggers a response. This would be the food. The food is something outside of the dog that would naturally cause it to react, to salivate. The unconditioned response or unlearned response. So the response is what you do or the dog does, whatever the organism. So what does the dog do naturally when they get the food? Well, they salivate to the food. That's natural. So what you're going to have happen, you're going to pair the bell with the food. bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. And it's got to be in the order of neutral, then unconditioned. You can't flip it around and go food, then bell. That doesn't work. It's got to go bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. Because again, the whole purpose of classical conditioning is that we are trying to help you predict the future. After several trials, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. So after pairing the bell with the food numerous times, the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus. So previously neutral stimulus, that after association with an unconditioned stimulus comes to trigger a conditioned response. And now the conditioned response, it's the same behavior, but instead of salivating to the food, now they salivate to the bell. So it's the learned response. What is the dog learning to do? It's learning to salivate to the bell. And generally this becomes like a reflex. The thing about classical conditioning is it's not something that you can like control. If you've been classically conditioned, this response will be involuntary. A few other examples. You think about people who are like cancer patients. Oftentimes they'll get sick due to the drugs that they're given, like the chemotherapy. So the unconditioned stimulus would be the drug, which naturally causes nausea. But if they go to the doctor frequently enough, they'll sit in the waiting room and they know they're going to get the drug, which is going to make them nauseous. So what eventually happens is they go to the waiting room, they know they're going to get the drug, they know they're going to get nauseous. So now just sitting in the waiting room causes them to be nauseous. So it becomes a condition. So this would be like the bell, and this would be the salivating to the bell. This would be this would be the bell. This would be the food. So bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. Salivation, eventually bell, salivation to the bell. That would be the parallel to the Pavlov example. Here's a little more lighthearted one. This is another study. So they had these couples come in and like make out and then eat chips. So the unconditioned stimulus would be kissing someone you're attracted to. That would be an unconditioned stimulus, like the food for Pavlov's dogs, that would lead to romantic arousal. So kissing someone you're attracted to would make you aroused. Well, then they had one of the people in the, that was dating the other person eat these chips that were like crazy strong, onion flavored, gave them like terrible onion breath. This would be like the bell. So they would eat the chips, then make out with their partner, which caused romantic arousal. And after doing that a few times, now the people became aroused just smelling onion breath. So just like the dog learned to associate the bell with the food, these people learned to associate onion breath with making out. So that's what's going on here. It's allowing you to predict the future. So you're smelling the onion breath, you're thinking, ooh, I'm about to make out with somebody, and you get romantically aroused. We'll do more practice with these in class, kind of face-to-face. It generally takes people a little bit of practice to get these. There's also a practice worksheet on Moodle, so you'll want to practice with that as well. And we'll kind of get into more specifics with classical conditioning as well. There's a few other terms that you want to know that go along with this. So we'll wrap up for now, but again, check out those other videos so you get a full picture of what classical conditioning is all about. So it's a good place to stop. We'll talk to you soon.